following is brought to you by ACT, Agora Center of Thought, here on the Voluntary Virtues Network, every Saturday night, 8 to 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. Join us as we dispel the illumination of status sophistry with the dark web of Agora's philosophy. Agora, Anarchy, Action.
Yes. We are live, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Agora Underground here on the Voluntary Virtues Network. I am Comrade Dick, your host, and thank you for tuning in. It is June 13th here, 2015, 8 o'clock Central Standard Time, and we are going to continue breaking down. As you well know, we are a show on economics primarily, and philosophy, and objectivism, libertarianism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we're the Agora Underground, so we do believe in agorism and analyzing such and promoting counter-economics and agorist philosophy. But in order to fully comprehend agorism, we need to go back to where it all sprang from, essentially, and that is the new Austrian movement, or Rothbardianism, as many people know it. And we have been going through power, economy, and state, or man, economy, and state, power, and market. They're getting the words jumbled up. And been going through power and market. Quite an interesting analysis here on the different forms of intervention that the state plays upon the economy. And we have been reading through the section triangular, as y'all well know, if you've been keeping up with the show, triangular intervention, as opposed to binary intervention. And there's quite a few. I mean, we're pretty much analyzing every single mode of interventionist policy that the government engages in. So have been going through, as of late, antitrust laws. The supposed assumption that the market will inevitably leads to essentially monopoly, right? Conglomerization, and we need government, a monopoly in itself, to somehow come in and make sure that the playing field is evened out a little bit. As we have seen, it usually doesn't work that way. It usually ends up creating more problems. So we had finished last week here the main paragraph, the first paragraph on page 1118 in Man, Economy, and State with Power and Market. And we were just going to read here, continue on, again, talking about antitrust laws. So definitely look forward to this. See what else we could learn today. And by the way, you guys do feel free to tag along, read along, and shoot me any messages. Comment if you would like us to cover something differently or do something differently. Any suggestions, whatever, feel free to. We definitely enjoy the feedback. So it is vain, however, to call simply for clear statutory definitions of monopolistic practice. For the vagueness of the law results from the impossibility of laying down a cogent definition of monopoly on the market. It's very hard, right? So this is the problem with laws. Hence, the chaotic shift of the government from one unjustifiable criterion of monopoly to another, be it size of the firm or the closeness of substitutes or the charging a price too high or too low or the same as a competitor, merging that substantially lessens competition, etc. Right? This is pretty epic here. I mean, essentially, if you're a business and hey, your prices are too high, you're accused of price jacking, price hiking, right? If your prices are too low, you're accused of undercutting the market and ripping people off, essentially. And if you charge the same, you're accused of colluding with your competition. And so antitrust laws come into play, right, at this situation, at this point. So either way, I mean, it's pretty clear here that you are an enemy of the state. You are labeled a potential threat, a threat to the power structure of the government for simply wanting to sell a product or a service. So merging that substantially lessens competition, etc. Right? So they're saying, oh, we got to widen up the competition. All these criteria are meaningless. An example is the criterion of substantially lessening competition. This implicitly assumes that competition is some sort of quantity, but it is not. It is a process whereby individuals and firms supply goods on the market without using force. To preserve competition does not mean to dictate arbitrarily that a certain number of firms of a certain size have to exist in an industry or area. It simply means that to see to it that the men are free to compete or not to, unrestrained by the use of force. Very true, right? I mean, the second you start meddling with the market and treating some players differently than others, you have created an inequality there. Essentially, you have created um, unethical force that plays into the system now, because you're essentially forcing some firms to conform to and mold into your particular regulation or whatever it might be, whatever arbitrary hula hoop it might be for the day, hoop, flaming hoop you got to jump through for the day. Um, so really, I mean, I don't know what people have an issue accepting this for. To them, it's okay. I mean, you debate socialists all the time as a capitalist, and you come to realize that people, for whatever reason, believe that once a firm gets to, I don't know, 1,000 employees, or once it gets to grossing in, I don't know, $10 million or something, it somehow, mutates and transforms into, some kind of evil entity, right? A parasite upon society because of size alone, as if that determined whether it was ethical or not. People have no standard of ethics, and that is a problem. We know that that's a problem. How do we get people on board? Well, one mind at a time, one idea at a time. So, the original Sherman Act stressed that collusion and restraint of trade. Here again, there is nothing anti-competitive per se about a cartel, for there is conceptually no difference between a cartel, a merger, and the formation of a corporation. All consist of the voluntary pooling of assets in one firm to serve the consumers efficiently. If collusion must be stopped and cartels must be broken up by the government, an example, if to maintain competition it is necessary that cooperation be destroyed, then the anti-monopolist must advocate the complete prohibition of all corporations and partnerships. Only individually owned firms would then be tolerated. I mean, so true, right? So true. At what point is it too much collusion? You can't have 10 business owners come together and come into an agreement on something, but you can have 3 or whatever, right? 4. So you're telling me somewhere between 4 and 10 it becomes wrong, and the government needs to step in. Again, arbitrary regulations set upon the market that have no bearing in reality. So aside from the fact that this compulsory competition and outlawed cooperation is hardly compatible with the free market that many antitrusters profess to advocate, the inefficiency and lower productivity stemming from the outlawing of pooled capital would send the economy a good part of the way from civilization to barbarism. Interesting, right? Interesting on so many levels here. Something that comes immediately to mind is infrastructure. Infrastructure, as statists always love reminding free marketeers, is quite expensive, right? Quite an investment. Most likely going to involve multiple firms coming together in order to provide for masses of, stretch of concrete that go on for miles and miles and miles, and bridges. And I mean, think about all the iron and right, all the tar involved, and the workers, and just everything, the massive amount of production that and the scale and level of that level of production. It's going to involve a lot of people, and most definitely a lot of firms. Is it really any surprise that we haven't seen many free market responses to things that we would typically, leave to the government alone, dams and roads and airports and things of this nature, right? I mean, when the government has antitrust laws and anti-collusion laws, in order to free up the market, some things are inevitably lost. Some things that we could have had if multiple firms would have come together and pulled their capital and resources together, they could have came up with solutions that were right necessary, that were being demanded in society, and that were definitely possible with the technology. But simply, through these arbitrary laws now, anti-collusion, antitrust laws, now we can't have those things. Now it's just only put in the government's hands. What a convenient little series of events there. It's almost as if they knew what their economic policies lead to. So an individual becoming an idle instead of working may be said to restrain trade, although he is simply not engaging in it rather than restraining it. If antitrusters wish to prevent idleness, which is the logical extension of the W.H. Hutt concept of consumer sovereignty, then they would have to pass a law compelling labor and outlawing leisure. A condition certainly close to that of slavery. To see that, I would like to see that reference. That is crazy right there. Municipal ordinances against vagrancy or loitering are certainly a beginning in this direction and are used to impose forced labor upon the poorest sectors of the population. Wow, very interesting. So let me catch this here real quick. So an individual that becomes idle instead of working may be said to restrain trade, although he is simply not engaging in it rather than restraining it. If antitrusters wish to prevent idleness, which is the logical extension of the W.H. Hutt concept, yeah, I mean, this is. Did we read about the Hutt concept? Let's see here. Give me 1 second, ladies and gentlemen. The brilliant discussion of the Anti-Child Labor Factory Acts in early 19th century Britain see Hutt, the factory system, on the merits of child labor. So definitely, this is an internal here reference from another economist. Not too familiar with this argument. I don't know how antitrust laws will essentially want to prevent idleness. I don't get that exactly, but this is a little bit off on as far as my level of understanding here. But not sure. But let's continue on here. Not a big deal. The everything prior to this made a lot of sense. So, but if we can find the definition of restraint to restraining the trade of others, then clearly there can be no restraint of trade at all on the free market, and only the government or some other institution using violence can restrain trade. And one conspicuous form of such restraint is antitrust legislation itself. Okay. So I guess he should have mentioned this first in the lineup, but hey, either way, it makes sense if you read it through. Essentially, it's an antitrust is anti-trade. If people, anti-contract. If people want to contractualize, again, we were talking about building a road or a dam or something like that. Multiple firms want to come together and contract or trade that project together and work on it together as a co-op, if you will, of different industries and businesses. There's really nothing wrong with that if it's all voluntary. No force is being applied on anybody in the market. Should be fine, right? Should be completely allowed. There's nothing unethical about it. It's restraining others that government does that causes the problems, isn't it? And that's what antitrust law. So I get what he was getting at there. Now, makes sense. So on the few cogent discussions of antitrust principle in recent years has been that of Isabel Patterson, as Mrs. Patterson states. Standard Oil did not restrain trade, it went out to the ends of the earth to make a market. Can the corporation be said to have restrained trade when trade they catered to had no existence until they produced and sold the goods? Were the motor car manufacturers restraining trade during the period in which they made and sold 50 million cars, where there had been no cars before? Surely nothing more preposterous could have been imagined than to fix upon the American corporations, which have created and carried on in ever increasing magnitude a volume and variety of trade so vast that it makes all previous production and exchange look like a rural roadside stand, and call this performance restraint of trade, further stigmatizing it as a crime. Interesting. Well, we do know that big oil, obviously, in the early 20th century, as well as big steel, got a lot of the whole progressivist movement set out to regulate big industry was actually funded by big industry in order to have obviously big industry entangle itself through legislation even more into the market and ensure their monopoly. But I don't think that that's the point that Isabel here, this lady, was trying to make, Miss Patterson. It's when a lot of people get, I've noticed a lot of people get confused about this too, whether they're already ANCAP or not, is they'll take ANCAP's defense of industries like this, and or what may seemingly seem like a defense, and take it to its full conclusion, which or extreme conclusion or extreme application, and it ends up not working out as well. And I don't think that's the point that Isabel was trying to make here. She's trying to point out that whenever there's a new industry, which usually comes about with several other industries pulling together in some form of, pulling together of funds and capital and cooperation, collusion, and new technologies created or new innovations come into play or new infrastructure or new pretty much anything, right? Depending on where we're at in the moment of civilization, can come about. And she's arguing here that to then restrain the possibility for companies to merge or companies to work together is actually in fact restraining trade itself, right? And then, but they are the ones to say that, oh, look, you're doing so much harm to the market, just like the robots. I mean, this really ties in just like the whole $15 an hour for robotic labor movement, right? I mean, think about it. I mean, if once robots come into the equation, which they're going to here in any day now, a lot of people are going to decry robotic production as an atrocity, as an atrocity that should be stomped out of civilization because people are losing their jobs, right? Don't take my job. Meanwhile, they're also complaining that they're having to work too much and that their jobs are too manually demanding, right? Which doesn't make any sense. Do you want the technology or not? Do you want to dig the ditch with your hands or, right, with a backhoe? I mean, so, and some dynamite, right? But that's a good point from Isabel here. I mean, again, she's not defending big oil and everything that they did per se. She's simply defending the idea of new industries when they do arise, new markets, when they do spring into creation. It would be ludicrous to say that that's a restraint on trade, which is exactly what the government does with their laws, in particular antitrust laws. So Ms. Patterson concludes that government cannot restore competition or ensure it. Government is monopoly, and all it can do is impose restrictions which may issue in monopoly when they go so far as to require permission for the individual to engage in production. This is the essence of the society of status. The reversion to status law in the antitrust legislation went unnoticed. the politicians had secured a law under which it was impossible for the citizen to know beforehand what constituted a crime, and which therefore made all productive effort liable to precaution, or I'm sorry, liable to persecution, uh, if not to certain conviction. Wow, this is wow. I'm not familiar with Miss Isabel Patterson, but definitely going to check her out. Those are some quite interesting words there. It's like we were talking about earlier, right? Finding you if you charge too low, if you charge too high, and if you charge the same. Production is evil. Don't produce. Work for the producers. Just be another cog, another brick. So we're going to continue on. In the early days of the trust problem, Paul de Rousiers commented that directly the formation of trust is not induced by the natural action of economic forces. As soon as they depend on artificial protection, such as tariffs, the most effective method of attack is to simply reduce the number and force these protective accidents to the greatest possible extent. We can attack artificial conditions, but are impotent when opposing natural conditions. America has hitherto pursued the exactly reverse methods, blaming economic forces tending to concentrate industry and joining issue by means of antitrust legislation, a series of entirely artificial measures. Thus, there is to be no understanding between competing companies, etc. The results have been pitiful, a violent restriction of fruitful initiative. The legislation does not touch the rest of the evil. It enlarges in place of restraining artificial conditions and finally regulates and complicates matters whose supreme needs are simplification and removal of restrictions. Yeah, so there's that argument. As with most of these things, licensing and regulating it as a whole, is that it's a overhead cost upon business. Um, I mean, don't know what else to say about that. I mean, it's people freak out. Again, I don't realize the logic or the deduct, what thought process people are going through. I've yet to realize figure out what are they thinking when we call for market-driven regulation and standardization, and somehow they think we just said we want no respect for. In other words, they think we want more of what we're already getting, right? They think we want more government, essentially. No one's private property being respected, chaos and rampage on the streets, and you not being able to trust anybody because everyone's trying to rip everybody off. Well, guess what? We're pretty much on that path now. Have been for a while, and if you haven't noticed that, you're pretty much blind. And if you think that it's more government we need, then you're not realizing what the problem is. But it happens. It happens. It's just something that requires a lot of mental application and strain, and it doesn't come naturally. We need to definitely think and read and make that effort in order to understand these things and further break them down and look into the stats, look into what actually works, and is there data to back up our assumptions or assertions. Interesting stuff, right? Interesting stuff. I would definitely have to agree with pretty much everything they said. Everything Rothbard said here, and Miss Isabel Patterson, some smart folk there. As far as economics goes, they were pretty much on point. I mean, it makes sense. I really don't understand why people think that that the market's going to lead to a monopoly. It assuming that everyone were to put in there, some collusion were to take place, there's going to come an eventual enough pressure with all the parties involved to essentially break that bond eventually. Right? Someone's going to want to undercut or overcut or do something, innovate, and want to get out of the restraints that partnership has put them in, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with breaking a contract or not renewing a contract once it's been set. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at all. It's only when we have these antitrust laws, it's only when we have government coming in and essentially granting no competition clauses, right, to certain industries and antitrust laws to other ones that they manage to on both. It's like the tightening and the loosening. They manage to really get things into their hands in a way that we just don't realize at all. The level of social engineering that's going on through economic planning, we just don't. It's almost like we're blind to it, and it's only when we start getting into economics that we barely start to understand, comprehend what's going on around us. Really is a matrix out there. So let's go on to section L here. We got a whole half an hour left, so let's just do it. Let's just keep going and figure out where this ride's going to take us next. Here, section L is outlawing basing point pricing. Interesting. An important example of the monopolizing effects of a program supposedly designed to combat monopoly is the court decision outlawing basing point pricing. On the free market, price uniformity means uniformity at each consuming center and not uniformity at each mill. In commodities where freight costs are a large proportion of the final price, this distinction becomes important, and many firms adopt such price uniformity, enabling firms further away from a consuming center to absorb some freight charges in order to compete with local firms. One of the forms of freight absorption is called basing point pricing. Ruling this practice monopolistic and virtually decreeing that every firm must change uniform prices at the mill not only prevents interlocational competition in such industries, but confers an artificial monopolistic privilege on local firms. Each local firm is granted the area of its own location with a haven set by the freight costs of out-of-town rivals. Within which it can charge the customers a monopoly price, of course. Interesting. So this has to do with the distribution of goods, right? Obviously, you have distribution centers for big chain stores, right? And be them grocery stores or retail stores or whatever. So you have your distribution centers that are your areas where, from the factory, right, you make the product, then that gets sent. Which the factory you may only have, depending on your production in the factory, you may from one to I don't know, a couple dozen or something, spread across the U.S. or across the world. And I'm thinking a couple dozen. I mean, I'm sure there's some producers that have more than that, right? But so from from one factory to, or one area of production to multiple, right? X, whatever. Once a product gets produced, it's got to go to a shipping center, right? So they're going to have distribution centers spread out their targeted markets, their targeted areas that they want to go sell their goods at, so that then those distribution centers can send them out to the stores, right? This is where all the freights would come out of, all the 18-wheelers. Big 18-wheelers would come out of these distribution centers to go then drop off at your local store, right? Your local whatever, Albertsons or H-E-B or Walmart or whatever the hell, Kroger's and Whole Foods and Trader Joe's or what the heck. So point being is that and I've never heard of this. Interestingly enough, the price basing point pricing. I've never heard of that concept. It's interesting. So I'm guessing they're setting they're setting prices in order to adjust for the different freight costs. Some areas it's going to cost more to ship it to them in some areas than to other areas. So you need to kind of pass as an internal cost for the business. You need to pass that weight around to where that cost around to where you get as uniform of a price as you can get at all your locations, right? If you're a Target, if you're a Walmart, if you're a Whole Foods or whatever, you don't want to walk into one and have one product there at $2 and then walk into another one 80 miles away or 50 miles away and then have the same product be $3.50 or something. It just doesn't. I mean, unless it's on sale at that particular store because it's cheaper to put it on sale and to ship it back to the distribution center. I mean, that's one thing, right? But to want to have uniform prices, that's actually a standardization that happens within a company that is beneficial, right, to the customers. It's more uniformity there. So instead of how do you deal with the discrepancies? Well, instead of adding it to the cost of the items and having different prices, you pass around the cost of the freight. And what I mean by that is you essentially say you in order to get rid of this extra freight cost that it costs you to ship it up to, I don't know, Alaska or whatever the heck, right? You only got a couple stores in Alaska in the distribution center there, and one of them, it's some town that's really far away or whatever the heck. Yeah, I mean, you're gonna have to pass those costs around, right? And you don't want it to be $20 just to get a gallon of milk in that one area that's really far, because nobody would shop there, nobody would live there. In fact, so instead of charging it to the actual delivery of that actual location, you spread the cost around to all the locations. So you may have the price of milk go up a penny at all your stores. If I'm starting to make any sense. If you guys are getting it, so essentially, there's some laws against this. I didn't know that there was laws against basing point pricing. So, what's your base point? That's interesting. Firms better able to absorb freight costs and prosper in a wider market are penalized and prevented from doing so. Well, of course they are. Furthermore, the decreasing cost advantages of large-scale market and large-scale production are eliminated as each firm is confined to a small compass. Firms' locations are altered and they are forced to cluster near large consuming areas, despite the greater advantages that other locations had offered to these companies. Furthermore, such a ruling penalizes small businesses, since only large firms can afford to build many branches to compete in each local area. So this is almost like a tariff, if you will. It's what it feels like, right? It feels like a tariff on outside bigger firms that may be coming into your locale, your area, and you don't want to have to deal with them. So you call for these basing point pricing controls to where the firm then is not allowed to essentially pass their cost around to other stores. Once we really start to think about how much government controls every step of the way, from production to your mouth, to your back, to your home, it is ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, literally every single step of the way is pretty much taxed, regulated, controlled, licensed, censored, prohibited by the state. That's all they can do. That's all their planning consists of. Social planning consists of is barring from possibilities, is inhibiting what is possible. That's all they can do, is threaten to hurt, right? They can't heal, they can't build, they can't produce, they can't provide anything of value. They really can't. And don't give me this crap about the military providing defense, because a multi-trillion-dollar defense budget was seriously, according to their own words, unable to stop a couple $1 million terrorist plot. September 11, Twin Tower attacks, right? Just a couple $1 million is all it took to penetrate a multi-trillion-dollar defense budget. So it's just ridiculous, the amount of control and regulation and levels of bureaucratic mumbo jumbo, red tape, and paperwork that one has to go through in order to simply provide the necessary goods and services that we all desire and need to survive and thrive and expand our prosperity. It is ridiculous. It is ridiculous. Just pay some slight attention, right? Where all the things that you consume come from. The process of production of those goods. And then take note of how many times Uncle Sam is there, shaking the coffers, trying to get those shekels from you. So if you don't hand them up, they're gonna pull out them swords. So it's quite a conundrum that we're at, ladies and gentlemen. It's quite a conundrum that we're at, and I don't know how better to fight against it other than becoming aware of their tactics and finding ways to counter them. That is really the only thing. I mean, because asking for permission, ladies and gentlemen, if you are really going to think that you're going to somehow reform the mob, I mean, bless your soul. I mean, you naive little creature, you. It's just not going to happen. And you're better off actually trying to make a substantial change in reality versus in this fiction known as government. So do we have time for this other section, Section M? Let's see how many more sections they got. Let's just go ahead and do it. Yeah, sounds good. Some more triangular intervention here with conservation laws. And yep. You can kind of see this go hand in hand with price jacking laws, right? What do they call it when you're not allowed to increase prices, right? Whenever there's a natural disaster or some kind of a shortage, their companies are essentially barred from raising prices too high, which is exactly what they need to do in order to at least have some material on hand for those that can afford it until there's more of a supply. So conservation laws restrict the use of depleting resources and force owners to invest in the maintenance of replaceable natural resources. The effect of both cases is similar: the restriction of present production for the supposed benefit of future production. This is obvious in the case of depleting resources. Factors are also compelled to maintain replaceable resources, such as trees, when they could have more profitably engaged in other forms of production. In the latter case, there is a double distortion. Factors are forcibly shifted to future production, and they are also forced into a certain type of future production, the replacement of these particular resources. Some Keynesianism here. So here the example is having to reforestation that's demanded by government. Now, obviously, right, this is an issue when, you're thinking here, if you're listening here, you're thinking, oh my gosh, what, these guys are against planting trees in the ground after they've cut them down. I mean, it's horrible enough to cut down a tree, such a beautiful tree, the lungs of the planet, and without, that's bad enough. Now you're just doing it without planting some new ones. Well, hey, before we jump the gun in here, let's rewind it a little bit. I mean, first of all, that we're calling ANCAPs alike, or all ANCAPs, all market anarchists, agorists, are essentially calling for a privatized society, right? So those companies that would be cutting down the trees would essentially have to be either doing it on their land or land that someone else owns and they were given permission to do so. In either case, there's an incentive there for them to replant trees at the rate that they see viable and feasible and profitable, right? So when they own their land, it's obviously likely that they're going to want to continue their income by planting more trees. If they're getting income from cutting down trees, well, you can only cut them down for so long until they're all gone, right? So you need to replant them. This is just a selfish interest, self-seeking, profit-seeking motive that the company will have, which would be more natural than the altruistic motive. But it's just a self-seeking motive that the company would have to ensure its future business. However, it would be done at the rate of supply and demand and all these other factors that are in constantly tugging at the world. So the problem here is that Rothbard is bringing up is pretty interesting, because he's saying that when the margin is higher than what it should be, than what would normally be, as far as forcing people to replant trees, usually on land that the government owns, has a sole ownership of it, and they're just simply licensing it out to loggers. Sure, logging companies are then forced to replant trees, which is an investment, right? It's a capital investment of replanting this tree. So you're going to want to regain on your investment, right? So it kind of traps them in this in this loop, if you will, of constant production. It's almost like a stimulation here into the economy, into the lumber industry, like a subsidy or whatnot. But I'll keep going. Clearly, one aim of conservation laws is to force the ratio of consumption to saving investment lower than the market would prefer. People's voluntary allocations made according to their time preferences are forcibly altered, and relatively more investment is forced into production for future consumption. In short, the state decides that the present generation must be made to allocate its resources more to the future than it wishes to do so. For this service, the state is held up as being a far-seeing, as being far-seeing compared to the short-sightedness of the free individuals, right, in the market, just getting that quick buck. You always hear it from the statists, right? They're trying to get that. Whoa, bless me, thank you, Lord. Sorry about that. Yeah, market's always the quick buck, right? The dog eat dog world, and everyone just backstabbing each other for the quick buck, for the quick 50 cents. And the government so wise and omnipotent and all-knowing that it's seeing into the future for multiple generations, and it's planning ahead for that, right? This is a general idea. Whether you can vocalize it and verbalize it and sense it for yourself, that may be another question, but it's definitely something that's instilled into us through the subliminal messaging that we're getting constantly into our subconscious. So what is the problem with this way of thinking? He's saying that presumably depleting resources must be used at some time, and some balance must always be struck between present and future production. So why does the claim of the present generation weigh so lightly in the scales? Why is the future generation so much more worthy that it can compel the present to carry a greater load? What did the future ever do to deserve privileged treatment? Interesting. Indeed, since the future is likely to be wealthier than the present, the reverse might well apply. The same reasoning applies to all attempts to change the market's time preference ratio. Why should the future be able to enforce greater sacrifices on the present than the present is willing to undergo? And interesting, very interesting, very interesting. Because again, presumably, it's a private society where people that are actually homesteading land and using resources are the ones that lay claim to them. And obviously, these companies just can't go around polluting everywhere, because again, people are living there and businesses are established and people are drinking from the water supply, and there would actually be liability issues against big oil and Monsanto and chemical companies that dump their waste into the water supply. there would be actual reparations in a private society, unlike in this state of society where they just get a slap on the wrist, on the hand, and a couple bucks out the pocket to the politicians, and hey, they're back to their everyday business, aren't they? So time preference, just to clarify for anybody that may not know, is basically $10 today for you. Think about it. $10 today to you is worth a lot more than $10, say, 6 months down from now. 6 months from today, right? $10 today, right now, are worth more to you than $10 in the future, which is why if, for example, you lend out $10 now, it wouldn't be that much of a stretch to ask for, say, 10%, 20%, $2 of a return on your loan after 6 months, 20%. I'm just thinking out here because you could have used that $10 on something else, right? On a chicken fried steak, on some new tires that you needed. And I'm using $10. I know that doesn't get you a Coke nowadays, but doesn't get you a Bud Light and a corn dog at the game or whatever, but or a freaking tub of popcorn or anymore, at the freaking movie theater. But nonetheless, government is coming in and telling you, hey, how much you need to save, how much you need to invest for the future, and how much you need to save for the future, and how much you need to spend right now. And that's an issue. That's an issue, right? That should be an issue to anybody thinking out loud and thinking this through. And really, another great point too is technology is always getting better, which is why Rothbard said that the future is going to be more privileged, more wealthy, right? Each consecutive generation tends to get wealthier, especially after the Industrial Revolution. It's almost, we're heading to like hyperdrive here, where we're pulling the Asiatic and African countries up to that higher standard of living, and pretty soon, poverty will be something of the past, ladies and gentlemen. Believe it or not, it's going to be done away with, and it's going to be thanks to technology and capitalism, not thanks to socialism. So, just to wrap this point up about time preference, it's not fair. It's not fair that the government has a right to tell people how much they should allocate and save for future consumption, as opposed to how much they're allowed to use now. So furthermore, after a span of years, the future will become the present. Must the future generations then also be restricted in their production and consumption because of another wrath-like future? It must not be forgotten that the aim of all productive activity is goods and services that will and can be consumed only in some present. There is no rational basis for penalizing consumption in one present and privileging one future present. Interesting. And there is still less reason for restricting all present in favor of some will-o'-the-wisp future that can never appear and lies always beyond the horizon. Yeah. Yet this is the goal of conservation laws. Conservation laws are truly pie in the sky legislation. Individuals in the market decide on the time structure and their allocation of factors in accordance with the estimated revenue that their resources will bring in the present as against future use. So in other words, they will tend to maximize the present value at any time of their land and capital assets. The time structure of rental income from assets is determined by the interest rate, which in turn is determined by the time preference schedules of all individuals on the market. Exactly what I was saying earlier. You lend $10 out, the market will decide what the right amount of interest will be on that. Because if everyone's allowed to lend out $1,000 or $10,000, those that have that to lend out, right, and it wouldn't be a loss to them if they did lose it, because those would be presumably those that would want to be lending out money. But anyhow, because there's always that risk of not getting it back, right? But anyhow, so if anybody that has the $10,000 to just possibly lose was able to lend out those 10,000 in gold or silver or Bitcoin or copper, whatever the hell, the idea is that the market, with so many people playing into it, right, and especially with this internet world that we have, where pretty much anyone is, the whole world is intertwined here, reachable. You can contact anybody on this freaking planet, really, like literally, and we're worried about monopolies forming in a decentralized society. Really, I just don't. I mean, this is blowing my mind. So I mean, so you have anybody that has the 10,000 in gold or silver, Bitcoin or whatever, that can lend it out. If everyone that would want to do that and has the ability to do so did that, there would be a essentially a interest rate that would be derived at over time, depending on the supply and demand, the demand of how many people want to borrow the 10,000 and the supply of how many people want to lend out the 10,000. There will be an interest rate that will be set over time. Now, don't kid yourself. The market is always reaching towards that, to that the ceaseless race against the rabbit on the track, right? The little what do you call it? The rabbit on the track around the dog races, right? Where you got that automated bunny rabbit running around the track. And I mean, that's essentially prices, right? In a free market, or interest rates they're always moving depending on supply and demand. Supply and demand is always changing. The population is always growing or being diminished depending on what's happening, right? Things are always changing. Factors are always changing in the market. So there's the ideal price or interest rate or level of time preference is always switching depending on the individual, depending on the market, depending on everything. So it's never actually arrived to. However, the market is always right behind it, right on its tail, right, always seeking towards it. And that's what would happen in a society with interest rates being set through time preference and by individuals in the free market. Instead of just saying, oh, okay, anybody with $10,000 has to, and is only allowed to charge, 8% interest on it, which is even super high for today, right? I mean, with what the Fed's setting. So, but that would be an arbitrary setting where how is the government supposed to know how many assets are out there and how many people want to borrow and all this? They don't. They should just let people be. No conceptualization here of spontaneous order whatsoever in these people's minds. Jesus. Just please come in. Just please, just enlighten these people. I'm sorry. I just get kind of heated here on this stuff. So time preference, in addition to the specific estimated demands for each good, will determine the allocations of factors to each use. Since a lower time preference will connote more investment in future consumer goods, it will also mean more conservation of natural resources. A high time preference will lead to less investment and more consumption in the present, and consequently to less conservation. So this is one of those reverse things, where the high time preference means you want to consume now, you want it immediately, you want the right now is the time to sell. Low time preference is you're willing to wait, right? There's no high return on the time that you're willing to wait. So interesting there. Conservation laws, getting some deep stuff here. So most conservationist arguments evince almost no familiarity with economics. Many assume that entrepreneurs have no foresight and would blithely use natural resources only to find themselves someday suddenly without any property. Only the wise providential states can foresee depletion. The absurdity of this argument is evident when we realize that the present value of the entrepreneur's land is dependent on the expected future rents from his resources. Even if the entrepreneur himself should be unaccountably ignorant, the market will not be, and its valuation, i.e. the valuation of interest experts with money at stake, will tend to reflect its value accurately. Very true. Even if one person messes up on the market, are we really going to assume that the whole world is messing up? Everybody, all those people that are lending out the 10,000 and everybody that's you may have one guy that falls for a group of people that fall for the 12% interest rate, but most people aren't going to fall for that, right? They're going to hold off for the 8%, right? And so you may have your occasional ripper offer, and you may have your occasional victim of being ripped off. But again, it's not going to be all of society. Not everyone gets tricked. If that was the case, we wouldn't have anarchism, right? The government would have reached 1984 by now. So, in fact, it is the entrepreneur's business to forecast, and he is rewarded for correct forecasting by profits. Ooh. Will entrepreneurs on the market have less foresight than bureaucrats comfortably ensconced in their seizure of the taxpayers' money? That is, I mean, here's an awesome point. As far as realizing, the true nature of the entrepreneur is to invest. Now, they may not be the capitalist; they may not have all the capital that they, that they're investing into this new industry or whatever, or this idea, this risk. They may have gone to different investors and made their pitch, right? But the whole point is that the entrepreneur reads the market and gets a hint, gets a hunch on the, or analyzes it and gets a feel, gets a hunch, gets a leaning, sees the stats and sees a trend and sees where the market may or may not be going, and has an investment or a an investment or something that they want to do. I forget what you call the other one. Not a dividend, but anyway, when you basically when you feel that the stock's going to drop. So he may feel an entrepreneur, more often than not, really it's on the positive side of things. They feel that some industry is going to grow, so they would want to then get capitalists to invest in their idea into an industry where they feel it's going to grow. And if they're right, then they're going to make some good profit, because they were the first one to willing to, go out there, get a lot of capital, and take that risk into this new industry. That is what entrepreneurs do. They forecast. They take risks, and they gain through profit. They lose through losses, right? I mean, it's loss of investment. Then you got a lot of investors pissed off and probably owe them a lot of money. So, but yeah, it's a lot more comfortable to boss everybody around when you're sitting on a big old tax funded chair and tax funded AC and your nice little, tax funded compounds, marble compounds that you guys have everywhere around town. So-called judges and enforcers of the so-called law. So another error made by the conservationists is to assume a technology that is fixed for all time. Human beings use what resources they have, and as technological knowledge grows, the types of usable resources multiply. If we have less timber to use than in the past generations, we need less too, for we have found other materials that can be used for construction or fuel. Past generations possessed an abundance of oil in the ground, but for them, oil was valueless and hence not a resource. Our modern advances have taught us how to use oil and have enabled us to produce the equipment for this purpose. Our oil resources, therefore, are not fixed. They are infinitely greater than those of the past generations. Artificial conservation will wastefully prolong resources beyond the time when they have become obsolete. That's a good one. That's a good one, because it's not until you have a scarcity or you start to have price increases that it becomes because of a low supply, right? You start to have the price go up, assuming the demand stays the same. You're going to have more and more entrepreneurs looking for alternatives, right? People trying to figure out alternatives, other markets that they can get this market to jump into. So it's a good point here with oil conservation, crude oil conservation laws, if they have those, you're only allowed to pump so much oil a year, or this or that. They cap oil wells. We know that they're capping oil refineries and primarily the wells, right? They're capping them, so, and not letting people mine from them. So, what's interesting is then essentially by conserving the amount of oil that we can use in the long run, it gives this false sense of how would you say compliance in that resource, right? It keeps the market going. Whereas if we were to literally one day start to run out of oil, right? If we saw that, oh shoot, we're running out of oil here, it's going down, prices start going up, supply stays the same, people are going to look for alternatives at that point because there's going to be an incentive to say, okay, well, hey, we're running out of oil, let's look for some alternatives, right? It's worth doing it now, right? But if you're always going to have oil there, then there's no reason to invest. There's no incentive to invest, and we sure as heck know that the government isn't going to do anything about it. I mean, really, we're gonna depend on some system that is the biggest need of antitrust laws to create something new. I mean, it's ridiculous. So that's a great point right here. That conservation, leads to prolonging the actual use of that resource you're trying to conserve. Now, with trees, you may think, okay, well, it'd be horrible to essentially, cut down all the trees and then realize, oh, why would you want to have the trees, to such a low quantity to where, oh, now we got to look for alternatives to lumber. Well, that's it's a mixed feeling with that. I mean, obviously we're way past the lumber days where, with technology, tree use is down, and either way, there's things that are inevitably going to change, and technology is always going to be on that incremental growth, exponential rather, growth. So regardless of whether resources are running low or not, people are going to find innovative ways to transform markets and transform technology, and it's going to continue to grow. But nonetheless, trees would then become something that people would want, right? I mean, if there's all of a sudden a shortage, I can guarantee you that everyone's going to be planting a tree in their house because it's going to become something of a kind of a prestige. And obviously, we need it to breathe. So I don't think anybody really wants to die. So the moment we start realizing that it's literally a big deal, I can guarantee you, everyone, it's going to be a pretty quick initiative to have everyone plant just a couple trees, and then automatically everything is going to be good. Not a big deal. So it's not as apocalyptic as it seems. What is apocalyptic is giving the whole world into the hands of a bunch of psychopaths and sociopaths. That is pretty much guaranteed apocalyptic scenario. But hey, what else apocalyptic is this show, because we are at the end, ladies and gentlemen. We have reached the end of the road for now, and it is 9:00, so we have to cut it off. Unfortunately, I don't want to go off too much on this. Got other things to do. I'm sure you do too. So I do appreciate you guys for listening in. As always, it's been a wonderful pleasure, an honor to be able to speak with you guys. As y'all well know, this has been the Agora Underground here every Saturday, 8 to 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. And do appreciate you guys for tuning in. Definitely going to be here back next week. And I just hope you guys have a great week in truth and laissez-faire attitudes and prosperity, and expanding your consciousness, your hearts, and reaching out to those around you to be able to get a little bit more liberty out there. So do appreciate it, guys. Laissez-faire to each and every one of you. God bless.
You have been listening to the Agora Underground. Tune in next week for more. Laissez-faire, comrades.